I've got 10 questions. I'm going to ask you 10 very specific, very interesting, very thought-provoking questions about how you feel about Genesis and some of their records that they've released and things that they've done over the years. And if you could go back in time and change anything. These are very, very in-depth questions for the Genesis fans out there. So I've got 10 of them. We're going to go through them together. I'll give you my answers. But here's what I want you to do. I want you in the comments just to open up. We're going to go through 10. So number one, push number one. And I want you to write your answer and follow along. You can even pause the video and if you want to think about it a little bit or be thinking about your answer while I'm giving my answer. But because I'm very, very intrigued. These are not just like your kind of your normal questions. We're going a little bit deep and I want to know everyone's opinion. And you can let me know, or if you don't want to add a comment, you can just follow along. But I think it'll be fun if you add your answers below. Okay, ready? Let's dive in. So what is your Genesis album you listen to the most? What Genesis record do you listen to the most? For me, man, I think I have about 5 or 6 that are heavy rotation for me. Like that would be like We Can't Dance, Selling England, probably Seconds Out, maybe even, maybe Abacab and Shapes. Like that's kind of my heavy rotation. Did I say Duke? Duke as well. For me, the record I listen to the most, I'll have to say We Can't Dance because it's a long record and I like listening to that front to back a lot. So I think like if you include it being a long record, I probably listen to We Can't Dance the most. What's it for you? What's the Genesis album you listen to the most? Okay, here's another question. What Genesis album, number 2, what Genesis album do you listen to the least? So I'd be curious about that. I think will probably be, the first answer. You see, what's interesting about the first question is that it's not like what's your favorite Genesis album? Because like maybe it's The Lamb. Maybe you think that's like their biggest accomplishment, but not a lot of people listen to The Lamb every single day. Like it's not something you can blast in the car. A couple songs are. So, it's kind of like a headphone experience. But however, I think there's probably a little bit more common answers when it comes to what records we listen to the least. I think probably most of us would say from Genesis to Revelation. Like I listen to the early stuff all the time. I listen to Trespass all the time. And I find myself listening to Calling All Stations quite frequently as well. So for me, it's easy. Number 2 is the Genesis album I listen to the least is From Genesis to Revelation. Okay, here's a very simple question. Let's do number 3. Let's do kind of a sort of an easy one, let's do a huge one, which is what's your favorite Genesis record? What is your favorite Genesis album? You can include the live albums you want. You can include a greatest hits if you want. This one for me. Okay, so I just realized that question number 3 is kind of generic, kind of cliche. I thought of a better one. I wish I had mentioned it, so I'm changing it now. Disregard whatever the Genesis favorite record is. We're changing it. Number 3 is, what is your favorite Genesis solo album? Because this is something I see come up all the time, and people have always like argued about best solo albums because there are so many great ones. And we're not just talking about debuts. You can pick anyone. So I'm changing the question. Question number 3 is, what is your favorite Genesis solo album? I think for me, that kind of zooming to the top is so Face Value, The Geese and the Ghost, and Small Creeps Day. Anyway, those are tricky ones, but for me, it's between Face Value and So as just when it comes to as an album. And honestly, this might surprise you, and I talked about this in a recent video, but I think I would put So ahead of Face Value only because I think it's a more realized album, and I feel like it's at a more mature state for Peter than Face Value was for Phil at the time. And I'm sure Phil would probably agree because like Face Value was like the first idea. Like if Phil was young and had no idea it was going to be an album he'd be defined by for 100 years. Whereas So was like, Peter had worked out some ideas and now had finally got this idea for a great sound and was able. So anyway, I just think So yeah, if I'm picking, so the question is, what is the best or your favorite Genesis solo album? There's so many to choose from, which is what I love about the Genesis universe. But I'm going to pick So, even though that's, that's stupid. But seriously, is my favorite album of all time. I suck at this game. Number 4, what is your most controversial Genesis opinion? What is your most controversial? Meaning, if you posted this in like a Genesis Facebook group, what would everybody get angry at you for? But here's what's probably going to happen. When you say this, what ends up happening, I think that like my controversial opinion, I find like
sometimes people post it online, and I'm like, oh, I'm not the only one with this opinion. And I always find that surprising when I say something that I don't like that seemingly millions of people like about the band. Then people who agree with me come out of the woodwork. So that's what I kind of think is funny is like, what's your like kind of cliche? What's your opinion about the band that like you think would get you blasted online, but then sometimes like people come out of the woodwork to support you? For me, and again, like I don't like to draw fire on this channel, but I think for me, there's a few of them. I have a few controversial opinions, but I think the biggest one would be I don't care for Supper's Ready. That's my answer. My answer number 4 is I don't care for Supper's Ready. Now, as with anything on this channel, I completely reserve the right to change my mind 10 years from now, 10 days from now, 20 years from now. And I might just. My issue is that when people refer to this song as an epic, they're giving it like credit that I don't think it deserves. To me, it's like they talk about Supper's Ready as if it just came out of the womb fully formed, like, Peter and Tony or individually had just this incredible brainiac moment and wrote this masterpiece in the way that we imagine Beethoven, like with the messy hair and scribbling on pieces of paper. But what we know is that like it's just these song ideas from all of the previous 5 to 10 years of them working together. And well, it wasn't that long, but just, several years of like, let's use this idea. It's basically like the 1970s equivalent of your iPhone voice memos and picking through these ideas and kind of intentionally piecing it together. I find it to me, it just is overrated. It gets more love when really it was kind of like put together as an epic by just piecing together other songs. So I feel like Supper's Ready is overrated. I think there's really beautiful parts to it. I don't resonate with the story. I don't think the story is especially interesting or exciting. Again, I do like the dream that Peter had this dream and it was kind of creepy and eerie. I do love the religious imagery in it. I like that a lot. But I personally don't care for it. And for that reason, I think that it gets like way too much adoration just as a song. Like the fact that it's two sides, the fact that it's an entire side of a record, is it multiple songs? Are we calling it multiple songs or are we calling it one song? What would people think of if they actually did that Duke suite? Would people say that's like the greatest song? If Turn It On Again was embedded in all of these other things that are happening? I don't know. Anyway, so that's my most controversial opinion is I don't care too much for Supper's Ready, but I might one day. When I did this survey too about the favorite songs, it was interesting because like some of the favorite songs that came out were like Firth of Fifth. I'm forgetting now. Behind the Lions, Duchess, I think was in there as well. Anyway, what's interesting was that there's a lot of people who had like a variety of favorite Genesis songs, but I feel like there was almost like an obligation to say Supper's Ready. Anyway. Okay, speaking of controversial, let's go with number 5. Who is your least favorite Genesis member? Okay, this is a silly question and it's mean, but if you do have to rank the members, I mean, on one hand, okay, so let's talk about just like the core 5, maybe the core 6, if you will. And we're not talking about Chester or Daryl. Unfortunately, they were never members. And I don't really know too much about like the later on members, although I guess it was just technically Ray who was a member. I can't go much further before Phil and Steve, just because like I don't remember all the different drummers back then. It was like Spinal Tap. So kind of going with like Mike and Tony, Pete and Phil, Steve and Ant, kind of like that being like a big iconic core, and maybe Ray as well. The thing with Ant is that we don't have a lot of data to go on. He wasn't really in the studio with the band for very long or on tour really ever. But I respect him because I love his solo material. I love that he's still making solo material. And I love the reason he left the band was for personal mental health issues, which I think was really brave, especially back then. So I really like Ant for that reason, even though I don't have a lot to go on. I think my least favorite member is Phil Collins. Yeah, that's why I created this channel, just to out myself as not a Phil Collins fan. No, I'm kidding. Peter, great. Mike and Tony are just opposite ends of the boat, just doing completely different things, but creating that core. I think like sometimes I feel some sort of like thing about Steve, because Steve and Phil are equals in a way. Like they both came to the band at the same time. They were outsiders, they were friends, but then for some reason, like Steve left and Phil stayed. And then it all of a sudden became Phil was the one responsible for driving it to the pop sound. And Steve was the one, because he's still doing the Lamb and Selling England, that he was the one holding on to the old prog years. I feel like that's like incorrectly assigned to these individuals. And for that reason, I feel like Steve's my least favorite member, just because of the baggage that went on around him leaving and the idea of him leaving to do more solo work. It was almost like, and I'm just projecting this, I don't know if this is true, but almost as if he was betting on himself more than on the band, thinking that the band was going to fizzle out after Peter left. Obviously, I think we all, in hindsight, him included, we know that he could have stayed on, and perhaps, I don't know if he would have gotten more material on records. For me as a songwriter, and I never work with bands because I don't like democracy in art, I could totally see his point. And if I wrote a great song and it wasn't considered for an album, I would be gone in a second. Doesn't matter if they're going to sell millions of records without me. I would be gone in a second. So anyway, this is a dumb question, but my least favorite member, I guess, would be Steve, just because of the baggage. I feel like it's more about the fans, the way the fans reacted. That like the prog era, the Seconds Out era is frozen in time for Steve. Whereas for Phil, a lot of the blame after Steve left, Phil then took on this blame that the band was changing. Okay. What is your least favorite Genesis track? What is this, number 6? Least favorite Genesis track. I would say there's a lot of them. Least favorite Genesis track. I mean, obviously, like there's the usuals, the Whodunit and Illegal Alien. I don't love Ballad of Big. I think that's probably my least favorite. I don't hate the chorus of it, so that maybe saves it a little bit. The other song I really skip a lot is Anything She Does. So I think maybe Ballad of Big or Anything She Does. Anything She Does and Illegal Alien's the same way, because it's the start of side B. So you flip over the record, and I usually drop the needle on the second track. So if we took out Illegal Alien and Whodunit, because I really don't like those, I would probably say Anything She Does or Ballad of Big. Okay. Number 7, what Genesis record do you wish could be removed from their catalog? This, to me, I think you're looking at either a record on either end, either Calling All Stations or From Genesis to Revelation. Calling All Stations, I'm an apologist for. I really believe in that record. I actually approve that record. I think that doing a record with another lead singer is not crazy. They had done it before to great success. So I'm an apologist. I love that record. So I won't say anything about that record. But going to the other end of the spectrum, From Genesis to Revelation just does not fit. I feel like Trespass begins something that they figured out what kind of songs they wanted to write, starting with Trespass, starting with Looking for Someone and The Knife. And I feel like from there on, they evolved. Yes, the difference between Trespass and We Can't Dance or Invisible Touch is drastic, but to me, to my ears, you hear that coming. You hear that the transition between Tricked and then there were 3 in Duke, and then Duke to Abacab, and then Abacab to Shapes and Invisible Touch. Those are stepping stones. That all works for me. Whereas From Genesis to Revelation just does not make sense at all. And we know the background of that. Now, there is apparently something happening with that album, that the right people have now the rights to that record. So maybe somebody will present that album in a way. Maybe if Tony gets involved, they'll present that album in a way that makes sense into their canon for us. But for a lot of us, no, it just does not fit into the canon. It's why I listen to it the least. I've probably listened to any other Genesis record 100 times more than I've listened to that record. Okay, moving on. Number 8. I think we're at number 8. What Genesis song do you wish you could have heard live? What Genesis song do you wish you could have heard live? Okay, so for me, now let's say, obviously there's YouTube videos, so I didn't get to hear Driving the Last Spike live, but I did get to see it on YouTube and on DVD. So I'm not going to count that. I'm not talking necessarily about being in person, but maybe just hearing a live version, having a live recording. I think a couple come to mind. I know that like a lot of Invisible Touch was played. A good portion of We Can't Dance was played. Most of their stuff has been played over the years. So I would probably go with Man of Our Times. I think would be really fun to see them play live, or even just to have a YouTube video of them playing Man of Our Times live. And then probably something, this is again my list, but I would probably say something really deep off of We Can't Dance. So something like Never a Time, or Way of the World. Now, Way of the World, I think there is a live version out there on that little kind of like fan disc that they made. So I think I have heard of live version of What Way of the World. But yeah, I would probably say some like one of the adult contemporary songs from We Can't Dance, Never a Time, Tell Me Why, or as I mentioned, Man of Our Time. Sorry, I'm giving many options there. Number 9, which Genesis member would you want to have lunch with? Which Genesis member would you want to have lunch with? Well, Phil. I mean, that's an easy one for me. Yeah, Phil. I think if you took away the obvious, Phil and Peter would be very interesting characters to chat with. If you took away the obvious, I feel like Mike Rutherford is like an untapped story, an untapped side of the story. Yes, he wrote his own book. Tony hasn't written his own book. Mike has written his own book. He focused more on his father and then the progress of the band. I feel like we never really got to hear about Mike's creative side and if I were to interview him, I would want to talk about his songwriting, because Mike is one of the greatest songwriters of our time, the most accomplished songwriters of our time. And yet Rolling Stone could make a list of 1,000 songwriters and he wouldn't be on it. 1,000 living songwriters and he wouldn't be on it. Yet he wrote Follow You, Follow Me. He wrote Turn It On Again. He co-wrote Invisible Touch. He wrote All I Need Is a Miracle. He wrote The Living Years. I mean, he wrote some massive, massive songs. And of course, I haven't even touched on his contributions to songs like Supper's Ready and Firth of Fifth. So I just feel like he is an iconic songwriter that nobody thinks about. Nobody thinks about him. And here's the thing, he's not a singer. You know, he's got some cool solo albums. A lot of people love Small Creeps. He's done a lot, but yet we just don't think about him as a lot of people think about Phil. A lot of people think about Peter. A lot of people think about Tony as like the driving composer to all these tracks. But when you look at songs that will last, I mean, a song like Follow You, Follow Me will last for another 300 years beyond anybody even knowing who Genesis was or who Mike Rutherford is. Even a song called Living Years, or All I Need Is a Miracle will last on. But Follow You, Follow Me specifically will last forever as like just a beautiful, beautiful love song. And yet it just doesn't really ever get attached to him. And so anyway, sorry, I just went on a little Mike Rutherford rant there on a Phil Collins channel. Maybe I'll start a Mike Rutherford channel one day. But I'm kind of interested. I'd be interested to talk to him because for that reason. But Phil is my answer. Okay, last question, and I just lost I literally think I deleted the email. I was going off. I emailed myself with a list of these questions. Okay, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because I know what the last question was. Question number 10. If you could go back in time, which Genesis tour would you go to? If you could go back and see any Genesis show, specifically tours, I know that there were some interesting, LA shows during the first Selling England tour when they were kind of introducing America to their band and to that album, the Roxy, I think. That would be remarkable. But let's talk about world tours. What would you go see? Would it be the Trick tour? Would it be the Lamb tour? Probably a lot of people would say the Lamb tour. Would it be that Selling England tour, that tour that we actually have video of that we can see and that the Musical Box are doing right now? Would it be some of the harder to, some of the biggest, the most iconic tours was the Duke tour and the Abacab tour, Duke, and then there were three, and then there were three at Duke. That kind of, those sets, we have a lot of bootlegs from that era, and those were really, really incredible shows. I kind of lean towards that. The energy of Phil and the band were really cool. Maybe it's something from the Shapes tour, which was kind of short. We don't have a lot of that. Maybe it's the Trick and the Wind tour. Perhaps it would be, for you, it would be the Invisible Touch Tour in 86, 87. Perhaps it would be the We Can't Dance Tour. Okay, so you know all the tours. Maybe you just regret that you didn't see them in 2021. I don't know. Maybe your show was one of the ones that got canceled, and if you could go back in time, that would be the show you would see. Question number 10 is, what tour would you go back, if you could go back in time, where would you see the band? I have two answers. I can't decide which one. One is kind of like the quick gun to my head answer, and the other one is like the deeper philosophical answer. The quick gun to my head answer would be the Invisible Touch tours. I love Phil with the long hair. The energy of that shows, the drumming, the Simmons drums, the set list was really cool too. So I would probably, and some of those outdoor shows, I would go maybe to Wembley and I would see that tour if I could be front row. You know what I mean? So I think Invisible Touch is where I would lean. My more kind of deeper philosophical answer would be 2007, because I was there in 2007. I was about 1 million miles back from the stage in Toronto at a soccer stadium. And I saw the Turn It On Again tour. In that moment, I was in a weird early 20s where I was kind of like nostalgic for Phil and for songs like Turn It On Again and Throwing It All Away and Invisible Touch and In Too Deep. But I wasn't yet as appreciative of everything as I would be later, closer to my 30s. So I was I took that moment for granted. That's why I would go back to 2007, because I took that moment for granted. I also took for granted, because I had just seen Phil a couple years earlier, I think, on the farewell tour. I took for granted that Phil was in incredible health. The fact that he was running around the stage, that he was going back to the drums, he was in the same health as he was in 92. He was incredible. So I took that for granted, thinking we'll have this for a long time. I would have never thought that in another 7 or 8 years, he would be much older, injured, not doing great, and sitting, you know what I mean? So, and not playing the drums. We didn't know that. It wasn't until maybe 2 or 3 years later that he couldn't play the drums anymore. So going back to 2007, I feel like I would do, because I just was there and I didn't appreciate. That set list is phenomenal. I mean, it's phenomenal. And introducing that Behind the Lines or Duke's Travels, or no, it was Behind the Lines into Turn It On Again, was just incredible. An incredible opener for the show. Jam-packed with stuff like Ripples and I Know What I Like and In the Cage. And anyway, the visuals weren't that great. The technology was pretty poor back then. The visuals in 2021, 2022 were outstanding. So anyway, my two answers are like, I did not appreciate 2007 at the time, but I was never at 86, 87. I was 3 or 4 years old. So that would be really cool. Anyway, there it is. Hopefully you've been following along. I can't read them back to you because I accidentally lost whatever I was reading. But hopefully you've been sharing your answers. You can go back over, and hopefully you've been sharing your answers in the comments below. And I'm curious. And thanks so much for playing along. Thanks for subscribing. If you're not a subscriber, please do. If you're not in our Patreon, please do. And a huge shout out to them. Thank you to them for supporting this channel, and got some really exciting stuff coming up on the horizon. Thanks for watching.